Welcome everybody to our
Okay.
Plexus pop-up conversation on adaptive space. This is so exciting. One, it's so nice to see new and long-term members of the Plexus network and community. And Michael, we're just delighted that you're here for all the connections that you have within the network and your book, which just is fabulous. And we're excited that you've taken the time to share it with us. So I am going to put myself on mute, and remember, the most important thing is this is your time with Michael. Michael, this is your time with the network. So feel free to add anything you want in the chat, and then at varying points, have questions. And we hope that you'll walk away with understanding that we're looking at lots of ways to really promote complexity thinking in all organizations. And there is no one right way to get there or to think about it, but the fact is that we're together thinking about it. So thanks, Michael.
You know, I have been a part of a research team for the last decade and a half who's been really interested in one core thought. And we very much started out with a complexity lens. And that core thought or research question was quite simply, why is it that some organizations seem to be adaptive and responsive to the outside world and, you know, the growing chaos that exists in this era of disruption, and yet seemingly, you know, equally fit corporations and or large organizations are not? And that was one single question that we were armed with, you know, and a small research team of us went out and started interviewing people, you know, again, about 15 years ago. What we discovered was a bit surprising to us. You know, we entered into it under this lens of emergence. We were looking for, you know, all the different things that you could imagine from a complexity standpoint, you know, a complex adaptive system. You know, what does it look like, you know, for local interactions? You know, we were interested in, literally, we coded most of the initial data sets, which were qualitative, around complexity dimensions. And, you know, people like Russ Marion, Mary Ulbein were engaged in this research initiative from the very beginning. And we were looking for, you know, a real strong empirical, you know, complex adaptive system story. What we discovered, however, was a bit of a surprise even to us. And I'm going to really share that through the first story, but you might not be surprised based on the title of this slide, is that, you know, the difference between those companies that were adaptive and those that were not had to do with, it was social. It would have as much to do with social capital and the way people were connected to each other as anything else. And, you know, I'll dive deep into the story, but I'm going to share a couple illustrations first off that will really get to this. The first illustration was a financial services company, which was one of the companies we analyzed at length. And we were simply interested, and we actually discovered this by surprise, but we were interested in an integration. And if you look on the left-hand side of the diagram that I have up here, you know, this particular company, which is represented by the pink dots, the purple dots here, was acquiring a smaller, more entrepreneurial company. The bigger company, and this is only a subset of that organization, not the entire organization, could be thought of as a fairly mechanistic, you know, sort of scalable execution machine, if you will. The smaller company was thought of and acquired simply because it was more innovative and entrepreneurial. So the thought process was this, you know, large company is going to acquire this small company, and pardon me, was going to fully leverage its capacity to be more innovative and leverage the innovations and ideas that it had. 6 months in, on the left-hand side, the only people that were connected between those two entities were the people inside, you know, this bubble, which happened to be on the integration team. The people who were engaged in the smaller, more entrepreneurial company were miserable. They hated this, you know, acquisition. You know, they screamed and raged against the fact that this larger entity was stifling out every creative, you know, idea that it happened to have. It seemed like a marriage that was a disaster. But then something surprising happened. And if you look on the right-hand side, you know, in an unintended manner, you know, people were pulled from the smaller entity because they were great leaders deeper into the core of the more execution-oriented organization. And you can see what happens about 18 months in with this network. As people are pulled into the organization, they bring their friends with them. In other words, as people from the center of the blue dot on the left-hand side are pulled into sub-pockets of the larger organization, what they bring along with them are their relationships. And then the surprise was this. When that happened, all of a sudden the innovation started to pop. So we did not, we weren't looking for this. We discovered this. And quite frankly, what started to happen was, the people who were connected to other points of influence inside the organization were able to bring the ideas that they originally wanted to, but couldn't get formally endorsed. They brought them into the organization through their social relationships. So, that's an acquisition. That was a surprise to us. And we began to think about, well, maybe this is an issue that's much more social than around setting up systems and thinking about leadership. That really struck us hard in the second story. This is a medical device facility. It's almost the inverse of the previous story. These are numerous sub-pockets, or you could even call them silos within this medical device facility. And in the center of this organization, these small white dots was a centralized innovation team. This centralized innovation team represented some very smart PhDs, some very brilliant design thinkers, about 35 in entirety, and across a 3-year time frame. This is one snapshot, but across a 3-year time frame, that group of 35 centralized innovators had a success rate of marketplace successes of 0. In other words, their hit rate in the marketplace was 0. So like any good manager, if you're not successful, what do? You diffuse it and you basically shut it down. That's exactly what was decided. The good news here for us as researchers was that these people were pushed out into the business because they were really smart. And then something remarkable happened when that move happened. After these people were reorganized, much like the first case study, innovation started popping all over the organization. So, by mistake in 2 cases, and then many other cases as we dug deeper and started to snowball these interviews back, we started to discover that it's not about the idea at all. It's about the social placement of those ideas on the network that seemed to matter most. And that was not something we were looking for. We did think that the network and connectivity had something to do with it, because clearly, that's a complex adaptive system, but we weren't thinking about the cadencing of those networks. So from that emerged a model, a framework that looks like this. And I'm going to draw some parallels back to some origins in complexity science from this. But if you could think about this, the 2 things that existed in every one of these 60+ companies, where every company had a fairly formidable operational system. You could think of that as the formal ways to get stuff done inside of an organization. Somewhat more surprising, but not completely surprising, was every single organization had local pockets, we call them entrepreneurial pockets, of great ideas. Even those organizations that weren't adaptive had really good ideas. They had the seeds of what they needed already within the organization, but it was only the ones that were adaptive that had the third dimension, which is what we call adaptive space. Now, if you go back to my 2 case studies, adaptive space can quite simply be thought of as the free flow of ideas into and across an organization so that they can be explored, exchanged, and debated in such a way that they can actually stand up and become formal. So I want to now, for those of you who are deep complexity people, I want to take you back to Roger Lewin's book, where I can't remember if it was John Langley or who, but the diagram that we all know today that shows a complex adaptive system with agents interacting at the bottom of the diagram, a new emergent order coming out that is in a cloud-like diagram, sort of the new order, and then that system playing back upon itself. This is our version of that model through our discovered research. We think these local interactions in the pockets, can emerge, into a new order that's the new formal operational system that feeds back on future entrepreneurial pockets. And the discovery we have here is that we think adaptive space is the key to making that happen. And I'm going to describe that in more detail next. But it's simply, adaptive space can quite simply be thought of as a free exchange zone where ideas can be transferred from these local pockets, both inside and outside of the organization, and scaled into the formal operational systems so that they can generate value and economies of scale in these adaptive organizations. So the rest of what I want to share before we open up for dialogue is exactly how we think this happens. And this is what the book, Adaptive Space, is about. But quite simply, it's not just social arrangements. It's not just social interactions that matter, but it's the cadencing of these interactions through what we described as 4 social arrangements that matter most. So if you think about it this way, and this is where I'm going to ingrain what we now know about network science and network analytics to the whole next level. If you think about it this way, if you need to discover new ideas, if you really are in the need of discovering new insights, you've got to get outside of the insular organization that exists in most cases. And all these adaptive organizations were incredible at discovery. The way you do that is through bridging connections, through brokerage, we would say quite simply. And you do that by ensuring that you're pushing people out of the center of the organization through things like design thinking to go discover something new in the world. But that's not enough, because ideas are cheap. And mostly what we discovered is these organizations already had good ideas. What they didn't have was the ability to bring these ideas to life. And that's where these development arrangements matter most. Amazon calls them 2 pizza teams. These can be thought of as cohesive clusters or entrepreneurial pockets deep inside of an organization that are super good at iteration, local interactions, iteration, elaboration, and refinement or experimentation. And that happens because you've got a small band of 6, maybe 8 people who are very fiercely connected with each other, deep trust, and they're willing to share ideas with one another in such a way that they take greater risk. And it's important because we all know that the initial idea is never the concept that will get implemented. It's just a seedling. So these iterations, as we know of them, and we very frequently talk about iteration inside of complex adaptive systems, have to happen in these tight, cohesive, semi-protected pockets inside of the organization. And once you know that, you can design for it and you can create these social arrangements, with some foresight. But that's not enough. What we know is that, and this is Lee Fleming's work from Harvard, what we know is that ideas that are developed inside these cohesive pockets are 43% more likely to be rejected by the broader organization. In basic change management, we call that the not invented here phenomenon, right? So you've got to get these ideas out of these pockets where people build great ownership, and it's good to bring them into the world, but it's not enough to get them diffused. That's where diffusion connections come into play. And this is where we really lean on 2 different theoretical underpinnings of what's happening with network science. One is brokerage. Brokers pull ideas out of the pockets and span across the organization. And Ron Burt spent a ton of time really elevating that theory to the level of we know that these ideas are shared and diffused quite frequently through brokerage. But there's another element of this that matters almost as much, and that is this concept of energy. And Rob Cross and Wayne Baker in particular have done some really pinnacle work in regards to energizers on the network. And what their research says is that energizers pick up ideas from these small cohesive clusters, and with a 4-fold impact, can actually diffuse them out across an organization. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a network diagram in a moment. But again, that's not enough. They have to become the new normal. They have to be embedded inside of that new operational system. And to do that, you've got to break down brick walls, and you've got to disrupt, sort of the social bubbles that exist today inside of organizations And that's where disruption connections lie. So I want to take you just on another short journey before we, again, have a conversation about what this means. And here's an illustration of, there we go. Here's an illustration of what discovery could look like. So this is a network diagram where we looked at 130 different people inside this network diagram. This is how we can measure discovery. We look at, this was external discovery in this particular case. We look at who the bridge people are. The blue dots in this case are a development team. The purple dots are, or pink dots, are the people who exist outside of the organization. So a completely insular organization wouldn't have any of those pink dots. But this particular case has, a lot of discovery already taken place. And I know this organization in context. And this is, most of those pink dots are universities in particular, or research partners. And there are at least 10 people that really own these predominant bridge connections. The white dots here are really bridge brokers, what we call brokers. They're bridging ties to the outside world. And what they do is they're constantly bringing in this influx of discovery so that the other blue dots inside this development diagram are able to have access, as Ron Bird suggests, access to 3 competitive advantages: access to new information more quickly than most people, so access to novel information more quickly than most people would, access to diverse sets of information that the blue dots wouldn't more typically have access to, and then just as importantly as those first two, control over the diffusion of how those ideas are introduced into the organization. A good example of this is what IBM does with their innovation scouts. IBM has these, brokers that are designed precisely to do exactly what this diagram is suggesting needs to be done, and that is constantly bridge into the outside world so that people can discover new things. But as I shared before, that's not enough. You've got to bring these things into the world. And here's another illustration to show that. The right-hand side of this chart are the blue dots I just showed you. So if you just took the pink dots out for a moment and only looked at the internal people, those are represented by green on the right-hand side. That is a traditional development model, but the left-hand side is the model that I want. The left-hand side are these small, cohesive two-pocket teams, that are designed to move at speed. The reason they move at speed is because they've got great social cohesion and very tight sets of relationships where everybody knows everybody. And it's almost as if you can think of this, I think of it, my metaphor that I use very frequently, it's more than a metaphor, it's an illustration, is the Navy SEALs teams. They develop very cohesive trust to the point when they're really, executing, they're fluidly moving and they know who to go to. They know who all the people, they know everybody on the team, and they can almost intuitively anticipate where people are going to be. It turns out that this is a phenomenal design for moving fast into a unpredictable world. And this particular case, I won't share the actual innovation that's happening here, but I would just say that this particular design on the left-hand side has created 4 generations of a new technology in less than 18 months. And the way they've been able to do that is through rapid iteration. Each of those small colored pockets have one task at hand. They're small 2-pizza teams with a single thread task. Every single day they get new data and they start to process on that data where they're perfecting their algorithms or they're perfecting their software development. And then they plug it into the machine at the end of the day. So it's a sync and stabilize model. This is what we oftentimes see with agile design and development. And what it enables you to do is move super fast to create new models of things that have never been designed in the past. The right-hand model is the antithesis of that. This is far more typical than of what we see. Certainly, this was true in those non-adaptive organizations. And what you get there are the individual people or nodes are working on 3 or 4 projects at the same time. They're working with a combination of different people on each project. And what you get is confusion. It can develop. You can develop in this model, but it's not nearly as fast as the model on the left-hand side. Fact is, the model on the left-hand side is up to 20% faster than the model on the right-hand side. So if you want to develop something at speed, with speed, and you want to rapidly iterate it, using conventional innovation technologies or theory, if you will, like design thinking, it's the model on the left that's superior. So that's what we look for as we're thinking about rapid development. But remember, we've got to diffuse it. So let me talk a bit about energizers. So this is a network, just as an example, of 750 people. This is a network, where we actually map out energy, and we do that by simply asking people in this network, in the network, who are the people that most energize you. I picked 2 super energizers in this particular case, and using some of Kratakowicz and James Fowler's work on, connected, the power of social networks, we used an algorithm to, kind of the 3-degree rule of influencing of friends. And we used that algorithm in this particular map. And what we recognize is these 2 super energizers light up 23% of the network. In other words, using some good influencing theory, these 2 people can literally act as a tipping point for an entire organization of 750 people just by their energy alone. It's really important to mention that these 2 individuals have no authority, no formal authority whatsoever. They're both 20-something, individual contributors, and they literally have tipped this particular organization over and become catalysts for diffusing not just one idea, but many ideas across this broader network. And there were more than 2 energizers in this network. I just picked the 2 extremes to really illustrate our message. If I pick the top 10, that entire network begins to light up. So these energizers, when properly placed and socially arranged with some degree of intentionality, but yet high degrees of unpredictability, we don't exactly know how this is going to manifest on the network. They have tremendous influence, and that's how we think about this as adaptive space. So to summarize this, and this is a little bit of a mangled mess, sorry. I usually use phase-ins on this one, but we weren't able to get the slides to work correctly, but let me just walk you through this story as a summary. If you look at the green dots on the upper right-hand side, think of that as the operational system. I oftentimes describe that as the blob, right? That's the super tanker that delivers at efficiency and scale. It serves a very grand purpose, and it's critically important. And I think sometimes as complexity science people, we oftentimes, throw out the role of formal structures. They still do play a role, but it's the other dynamics deeper inside this diagram that matter most to me. Those small 2 pockets in the gray are the fast, agile, nimble teams. In fact, if I took all the connections out and reran the algorithm, that would look much like that fast speed diagram I showed a few slides ago. These 2 entities in particular are moving really, really fast. They've got good discovery because they're connected to the outside world. In this case, they're using design thinking to do that. There are many ways to do discovery, but it's these diffusion connections that I think are the most important of anything that I've said. These bridge ties, high energy bridge ties that link the super tanker of the green dots with the speedboats of these 2 smaller entities is the magic and the adaptive space that helps to pull these entrepreneurial pockets into the new core. And in summary, that's what we describe as adaptive space. It's the cadencing of these ongoing 4 sets of connections. These diffusion connections ultimately, help to seed the network to where you disrupt it with a new entity, with a new idea. And what we have discovered, first of all, through qualitative interviewing, and since then, we've been able to replicate by, plugging in these intentional social arrangements, is really emergence at its best. And, I can talk much more about the practical side of that, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on the front end before I turn it over to a dialogue to talk a little bit about what adaptive space is and how we've been able to really plug it in and create new management practices to enable an agile organization. So So Denise, that's what I wanted to share. It took a little longer because I can get carried away with some and geek out on all this stuff. But I just wanted to set some context, and now we'll just open it up. What questions or thoughts or challenges might you have? Anyone?